The sun was beginning to set when the first signs of something unusual caught their attention. The landowner stood at the edge of their property, gazing at the horizon. They had always been proud of this piece of land, a place that had been in their family for generations. It was more than just soil and trees. It was history, a connection to the past and a sanctuary for the future. The sound of distant machinery drew their attention back to the present. At first, they thought it might be a road crew working nearby. There had been talks of new development in the area for months, but they hadn't heard any official word that the construction would be so close. Curiosity led them closer to the sound. As they walked down the familiar path toward the edge of their property, they could hear the rumbling of heavy machinery, the clatter of hammers and saws, and the muffled voices of workers. Something didn't feel right. When they arrived at the edge of the land, their hearts sank. In the distance, they could see the frame of a house rising from the ground. Then another, and another. Rows of homes were being built, and from where they stood it seemed as though the construction was taking place on their property. Their first reaction was disbelief. It couldn't be. This was their land, the place they had spent countless hours working on and maintaining. They knew every inch of it, from the old oak tree on the northern side to the creek that wound its way through the western edge. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. But the more they looked, the more certain they became that the construction was happening on their land. Confused, they walked over to the construction site, their mind racing. As they approached, they noticed the large signs marking the project. New homes for sale, one sign read, with a logo of a homeowners association that they didn't recognize. The landowner's eyes narrowed. It seemed odd, and the more they thought about it, the more something felt off. This land wasn't for sale. It had been in their family for decades, passed down from generation to generation. There was no way anyone could have legally bought it. As they stood there trying to wrap their mind around what was happening, a worker walked past them. The landowner stopped him. "Excuse me," they said, trying to sound calm, though their voice betrayed the anxiety that was building inside. "What's going on here?" "This is my property." The worker looked at them for a moment, a mix of confusion and indifference on his face. "You didn't hear? The HOA bought this land. We're putting in new homes here." The words hit like a slap to the face. The landowner felt a rush of heat to their cheeks. "No, that's impossible. This land is mine." The worker shrugged, clearly uninterested. "I'm just doing my job," he said before walking away, leaving the landowner standing there stunned. For a moment they stood frozen, trying to make sense of the situation. Their mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. They had heard whispers about new developments in the area, but they hadn't been involved. They had never been contacted by the HOA, nor had they received any kind of notice about land sales or construction. But there it was, right in front of them, a growing neighborhood built on land that belonged to them. After a few moments of quiet shock, the landowner turned and walked back to their house. They needed to think, to process what had just happened. The more they thought about it, the angrier they became. How could this have happened? How could someone just take their land without their knowledge? Back at home, they sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers that lay in front of them. The deed to their property, the maps that clearly outlined the boundaries of the land. Everything was in order. This land was theirs, and no one had the right to take it from them. They grabbed their phone and began searching for information about the HOA. The more they dug, the more unsettling things became. The HOA was large, well-funded, and had a reputation for pushing through developments, often with little regard for the rights of individual landowners. There were reports of similar situations, but none that had escalated to the point of building 88 homes on someone's land. It was clear now. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act. Someone had knowingly crossed the line, taking what wasn't theirs. But the landowner wasn't the type to back down easily. They had worked hard for this land, and they weren't going to let anyone take it from them without a fight. The first thing they did was consult with a lawyer. They needed to know what their options were. Could they stop the construction? Was there any chance of getting their land back? The lawyer listened carefully, taking notes as the landowner explained the situation. When they finished, the lawyer's expression was one of surprise but also concern. "You have a strong case," the lawyer said after a pause. "If what you're saying is true and this land is indeed yours, then the HOA is in the wrong. But this could turn into a long legal battle. You should be prepared for that. The landowner nodded, feeling a sense of determination settle over them. They had dealt with difficult situations before, but nothing like this. The thought of watching their land be taken piece by piece with no way to stop it made them feel a mix of anger and helplessness. But they weren't helpless. They had proof. They had the deeds, the maps, and the knowledge that this land was theirs. That night, the landowner stayed up late making plans. They knew they couldn't just sit by and let the HOA continue with their construction. They had to act, but they also knew that they needed to be strategic. They couldn't risk making a move too early, without all the facts and evidence they needed. The next morning, the landowner drove to the property again. They were careful to stay at the edge of the construction site, watching from a distance. They needed to see how far along the work had progressed. It was clear that the homes were almost completed. The workers were now focusing on finishing touches, painting, landscaping, and other details. It would only be a matter of time before people started moving in. For the next few days, the landowner visited the site every morning. They took pictures, recorded the progress, and made notes of everything that was happening. They knew they had to be thorough, that every detail could be important if this thing went to court. But still, they did not confront the workers or the HOA. They wanted to see how things played out. They needed to gather all the information first. As the week went on, the feeling of unease only grew. The landowner spent hours researching the HOA, reading through every available document and public record. They discovered that the HOA had been in the business of purchasing land for development for years, often using questionable tactics to get what they wanted. They were known for pushing through developments quickly, using their connections to bypass local regulations and laws. But this was different. This was personal. The landowner knew they had to act soon, but they were determined to do it the right way. They weren't going to let the HOA get away with this. They weren't going to let someone take what belonged to them without a fight. They had the proof, and they were ready to show it. But for now, they had to wait. The game had only just begun, and the landowner was determined to play it to win. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and research. The landowner's mind never seemed to rest, constantly turning over the details of what had happened and what was still to come. The discovery that their land was being developed by the HOA without permission had shaken them to their core. They had never imagined that something like this could happen. No warning, no communication. Just the sudden appearance of 88 homes where once there was only wide open space. They spent the first few days after the discovery in a haze of confusion and frustration. Their mind raced with thoughts of how to proceed. Should they approach the HOA directly? Should they try to resolve this amicably? Or was it too far gone for that? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that this was no simple misunderstanding. The HOA had made a clear decision to move forward with construction, and they weren't likely to back down easily. The landowner couldn't let this slide, though. This land was their heritage, their family's legacy. They couldn't allow anyone to take it from them. The first step was to gather as much information as possible. The landowner dug into every document they could find, poring over deeds, maps, and legal records. The more they looked, the more certain they became that the HOA had no right to the land. Everything was in order on their side. The landowner had been careful over the years to keep up with the paperwork, ensuring that everything was clear and legitimate. Their family had owned the land for generations, and it had always been passed down with great care and responsibility. But despite all the evidence they had, the landowner knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough to win this battle. They needed a strategy, a way to approach this that would ensure they could get their land back without risking everything. That's when they decided to consult a lawyer. The first meeting with the lawyer was a quiet one, held in a small office lined with legal books. The lawyer listened carefully as the landowner explained the situation, detailing the construction and the HOA's involvement. The lawyer nodded occasionally, taking notes and asking a few questions along the way. When the landowner finished, there was a long silence. The lawyer sat back in their chair looking thoughtful. "You have a strong case," the lawyer finally said. "If what you're saying is true, the HOA is in the wrong. They're building on land that isn't theirs and they have no legal claim to it." The landowner's heart lifted at the words. For a brief moment it felt as though the weight they had been carrying for the past week might finally begin to lift. The lawyer continued. But this could turn into a long legal battle. The HOA is powerful, and they have the resources to drag this out. You need to be prepared for that, the landowner nodded. They had known that this wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from a professional made it all the more real. I understand, they said, but I'm not going to let them get away with this. The lawyer smiled faintly. That's the spirit, but you'll need to be strategic. You can't just barge in and demand they tear down the houses. You need to build your case, gather all the evidence you can, and approach this carefully. If you do it right, you'll have a good chance of winning. The advice gave the landowner a sense of purpose, and with the lawyer's help, they began to piece together a plan. They would need to document everything, every conversation, every piece of evidence, every move the HOA made. They would need to gather all the official records, contact the local authorities, and make sure that nothing was overlooked. They knew this would take time, but they were willing to do whatever it took to get their land back. Over the next few weeks, the landowner focused entirely on the task at hand. They visited the construction site every day, taking pictures and making notes. They watched as the workers continued to build, oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on land that wasn't theirs. The landowner didn't approach them or try to interfere. They knew that any confrontation could make things worse. Instead, they quietly observed, gathering as much evidence as they could. They also started to gather information about the HOA itself. They discovered that the organization had a reputation for aggressive development and for using its influence to push through projects without regard for local laws or property rights. It wasn't the first time the HOA had been involved in disputes, but this case was different. This time, the landowner wasn't going to back down. As the weeks went by, the construction site continued to grow. The homes were taking shape, and soon the land that had once been theirs was nearly unrecognizable. The landowner watched in silence, their frustration and anger growing with every new house that went up. They felt as though they were losing something they couldn't get back, and it was hard not to feel helpless as the homes continued to rise. But despite the growing tension, the landowner remained focused on their goal. They knew that any action taken too soon could jeopardize their chances of winning in court. They had to wait for the right moment. But that moment was coming. The HOA had made their move, and now it was time for the landowner to make theirs. In the meantime, they continued to prepare, consulting with their lawyer, making sure everything was in order. They knew they had to be meticulous to ensure that they had every piece of evidence they might need when the time came. The process was slow, but the landowner remained determined. They had already made up their mind. They weren't going to let the HOA steal their land. They would fight, no matter how long it took. Then one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. The landowner was walking down the road near the construction site when they noticed a group of workers gathered around a large set of blueprints. They were discussing something in hushed voices, looking back toward the landowner's property. The landowner paused, wondering what was going on. A few moments later, one of the workers noticed them standing there. "Hey, you," the worker called out, approaching them. "You're the one who owns that land, right?" The landowner nodded slowly, bracing themselves for what was coming. The worker's expression was serious. "Listen," the worker said, lowering his voice. "We've been told to keep working here, but we all know this isn't right. We're just following orders. But if you've got legal proof, I think it's time you stepped in. This has gone too far." The landowner was taken aback by the worker's words. It was clear that not everyone involved in the construction was comfortable with what was happening. The worker continued, "I don't want to get in trouble, but I think you should know. The HOA is pushing hard to finish this project, but I don't think they realize just how serious this is." The landowner thanked the worker, their mind racing. It was becoming clear that the HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were operating with a sense of entitlement, as though they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. But now the landowner had a new ally, someone on the inside who understood the situation and was willing to speak out. That afternoon, the landowner returned home with a renewed sense of determination. They knew the time to act was drawing near. The battle was far from over, but they were no longer alone in this fight. With the support of their lawyer and the inside information they had just received, the landowner was ready to take the next step. The HOA had underestimated them, and now they would learn just how far the landowner was willing to go to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The weight of everything was beginning to settle in. The landowner had spent weeks gathering evidence, consulting with lawyers and preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of their land. But despite all the careful planning and all the research, they couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too quickly. The homes that had been built on their property were no longer just frames and construction materials. They had started to look like real homes. The small details, freshly painted shutters, neatly mowed lawns, and tidy driveways, made everything feel final. And with every passing day, it felt like the landowner was losing something they couldn't get back. They knew the time had come. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The landowner's lawyer had gathered all the necessary documentation, and now it was time to take action. But even with all the preparation, they couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. The HOA was powerful, with resources that the landowner could only dream of. They had connections and influence, and it would be no easy task to bring them down. The thought of going up against such an organized and well-funded group felt intimidating, but the landowner knew they had no other choice. The land wasn't just property to them. It was part of their identity, their family history, and their future. The decision was made. It was time to file the lawsuit. The landowner, along with their lawyer, made their way to the courthouse where they submitted all the necessary paperwork. The lawyer explained that the process would likely take some time, but they were confident that they had a strong case. The evidence was clear. The land was legally theirs, and the HOA had no right to build on it. Still, the landowner couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Courtrooms were places of uncertainty, and no matter how strong the case seemed, there was always a chance that things wouldn't go the way they hoped. In the weeks that followed, the landowner felt like they were living in a state of constant tension. Every day brought a new wave of stress, but they also knew that they were doing the right thing. They weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for justice. The realization brought some comfort, but it didn't make the process any easier. During this time, the landowner continued to visit the construction site. They had made it a habit to observe the progress of the homes being built, taking notes and photos along the way. Each visit brought a new wave of frustration, but it also strengthened their resolve. They could feel the stakes growing higher with each passing day. The homes were nearly finished, and once people started moving in, it would be much harder to undo the damage that had been done. One afternoon, as the landowner arrived at the construction site, they noticed something that made their stomach drop. The workers were no longer just finishing up the homes. They were starting to put in fences around the properties. The homes were beginning to take on the appearance of a completed neighborhood. It was as if the HOA was preparing to move forward, as though nothing had ever been wrong. It was a reminder of how much they had already lost. Feeling the weight of the situation, the landowner reached out to their lawyer again, asking for an update on the case. The lawyer reassured them that the process was moving forward, but they also mentioned that the HOA had already begun to fight back. The HOA had hired a powerful legal team to challenge the landowner's claims, and they had filed motions to dismiss the case. It wasn't unexpected, but it made the landowner's heart sink all the same. They knew the HOA wouldn't back down easily. They had the resources to drag this case out for years if necessary, and the landowner couldn't help but wonder if they were ready for what was to come. As the legal proceedings continued, the landowner began to hear more from the inside. The worker who had spoken to them earlier at the construction site had become a quiet ally, giving them updates about what was happening behind the scenes. They learned that the HOA had already started selling the homes that had been built on the land. The workers had been told that everything was above board, that the HOA had the legal right to develop the land, and that they were just doing their jobs. The landowner couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. How could the HOA move so quickly, knowing full well that they had no legal claim to the property? It was clear that the HOA wasn't just building homes, they were building an empire, one that would be nearly impossible to dismantle once it was completed. Despite the obstacles, the landowner remained committed to the fight. They knew they couldn't afford to back down. They had to keep pushing forward no matter how difficult it got. The court hearings, which had started out slow, began to pick up speed. The lawyer filed additional motions, and the landowner found themselves in meetings more often than not. They had to be ready for whatever came next. Then one day the landowner received a call that would change everything. It was from their lawyer, and the tone of the conversation was serious. The lawyer explained that the HOA had filed a counterclaim, challenging the landowner's ownership of the property. According to the HOA, the landowner had somehow lost their claim to the land, and they were now asking the court to dismiss the case. The landowner's stomach turned as they listened to the lawyer's words. It was a bold move, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. The HOA had resources and they knew how to play the game. The landowner took a deep breath and asked what the next steps would be. The lawyer explained that they would have to prepare for a battle. This was no longer just a matter of proving ownership. It was now a matter of defending that ownership against the HOA's powerful legal team. It was going to be a long fight, but the landowner was determined to see it through. The next few weeks were filled with more paperwork, more meetings, and more tension. The landowner spent long hours with their lawyer, reviewing every document, cross-checking every detail. They knew that this was their best chance to win, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The landowner was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but they refused to give up. The thought of the homes being built on their land, homes that were slowly becoming inhabited, kept them up at night. They couldn't let the HOA win. They couldn't let them steal what was rightfully theirs. One afternoon, as the landowner walked past the construction site again, they stopped for a moment to take it all in. The homes, the fences, the lawns, all of it was becoming permanent. It was a reminder of how much they stood to lose. But it was also a reminder of why they were fighting. This wasn't just about land. This was about standing up for what was right. The landowner had always believed in justice, and they weren't about to let a powerful organization trample on their rights. As they stood there, watching the workers go about their business, the landowner made a silent promise to themselves. They wouldn't stop until they had their land back. They had already come so far, and they weren't about to let the HOA win without a fight. It wouldn't be easy, but they were ready for whatever came next. The legal battle had only just begun, but the weight of it was already taking its toll. Days bled into one another, with each one bringing a fresh wave of pressure. The landowner had spent the past few weeks gathering more evidence, preparing for court, and trying to stay focused on the task at hand. But as the trial date drew nearer, the reality of what they were up against became all too clear. The HOA wasn't backing down. If anything, they were escalating their efforts, bringing in more legal experts and using every tool at their disposal to push the landowner to give up. Every time the landowner received an update from their lawyer, it seemed like the odds were stacked even higher against them. But no matter how difficult things got, the landowner refused to give in. This land wasn't just dirt and trees, it was part of who they were, a piece of their family's history that they couldn't just walk away from. One morning, just days before the next hearing, the landowner received a phone call from their lawyer. The tone of the conversation was calm, but there was a sense of urgency that wasn't there before. The HOA had filed an emergency injunction to stop the landowner from pursuing the case any further. They were trying to get the court to halt the proceedings, claiming that the landowner's actions were causing unnecessary delays and disruption. It was a desperate move, but it was a move that could delay the case for months, maybe even longer. The landowner listened intently as their lawyer explained the situation. "We can fight it," the lawyer said, "but it'll take time. We need to be prepared for a delay. The HOA is going to drag this out, hoping you'll get frustrated and walk away." Frustration was an understatement. The landowner felt like they had already given so much time, energy, and emotional effort, and now they were being told that they might have to wait even longer. But even though the lawyer's words were difficult to hear, they also knew what they had to do. They had come this far, and they couldn't back down now. They had to push forward, even if it meant fighting for months or years to get what was rightfully theirs. That afternoon, the landowner sat on their porch, staring at the construction site in the distance. The houses were nearly finished now. Some were already sold and people had started moving in. The sight of those homes, which had been built on land that didn't belong to the HOA, was a constant reminder of everything they stood to lose. The idea of waiting even longer to get their property back was unbearable. But they knew that if they didn't fight, they would lose everything. The following days were filled with court motions, legal jargon, and tense meetings with the lawyer. The landowner had to keep their focus even when everything seemed to be working against them. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, moments when they doubted whether they could keep fighting. But those doubts were always short-lived. Whenever they felt like giving up, They would think about their family's history with the land, about how many generations had worked the soil and cared for the property. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about preserving a legacy, about standing up for what was right. The hearing that followed was a tense one. The landowner and their lawyer were prepared for the HOA's attempts to delay the case, but the courtroom still felt charged with the weight of everything that was at stake. The HOA's legal team was well-dressed and confident, presenting their arguments with a polished air of certainty. They claimed that the landowner had no right to the land, and that the HOA had legally acquired the property through a series of transactions that the landowner had somehow missed. But the landowner wasn't intimidated. They had the proof, deeds, maps, and photographs that clearly showed the land was theirs. The lawyer presented the evidence calmly and methodically, with each piece of documentation reinforcing the landowner's claim. The judge listened carefully, but it was clear that the HOA's arguments were weak. They tried to counter every piece of evidence, but nothing seemed to hold up under scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable, with the landowner sitting at the edge of their seat, watching the legal battle unfold. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. They knew they were making progress, but they also knew that the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. The lawyers continued to argue, presenting new motions and counterclaims. The landowner's lawyer did their best to keep the focus on the facts, but the constant back and forth left everyone on edge. As the hearing continued, the landowner felt a flicker of hope. It was becoming clearer that the HOA didn't have a leg to stand on. The evidence was irrefutable. But just when it seemed like they might be getting closer to a resolution, the HOA's legal team made a bold move. They attempted to have the judge remove the case from the court's jurisdiction, claiming that the landowner had no legal standing to challenge the development. It was a desperate attempt to have the case dismissed altogether. The landowner's heart pounded as they listened to the arguments. The judge seemed to pause, weighing the request carefully. It was a critical moment, one that could make or break their case. The lawyer leaned over and whispered to the landowner, offering a few words of encouragement. "We've got this," the lawyer said. "Don't worry. The judge can see through their tactics." And then the judge made a decision. The request for dismissal was denied. The case would move forward. The feeling that washed over the landowner in that moment was indescribable. Relief, disbelief, and a surge of energy flooded them all at once. They had won a crucial battle, but the war was far from over. The landowner had been prepared for a tough fight, but this was the first sign that their persistence was paying off. The judge's ruling meant that the case would continue, and the landowner could keep pushing for the return of their land. In the weeks that followed, the landowner and their lawyer worked tirelessly to prepare for the next round of hearings. The HOA wasn't backing down, but the landowner was no longer as intimidated by their tactics. Every time the HOA made a move, the landowner found a way to counter it. With every new motion and every new legal argument, the landowner's resolve grew stronger. They knew that they were fighting for something much bigger than land. They were fighting for their future. As the construction continued in the background, the landowner found themselves spending more time at the courthouse than at home. The days were long and filled with meetings, but there was a sense of purpose in every moment. The landowner couldn't help but feel a sense of justice beginning to take root. It wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up to the powerful forces that thought they could take what didn't belong to them. And for the first time in a long time, the landowner felt like they had a chance. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The HOA was persistent, and they weren't about to give up without a fight. The legal team continued to throw everything they could at the landowner, trying to wear them down. But with each passing day, the landowner grew more determined. They had come too far to turn back now. No matter how long it took, no matter how many obstacles the HOA put in their path, the landowner knew they had to keep going. Their family's legacy and their own future depended on it. The months had passed in a blur of court dates, legal motions, and constant stress. The landowner had endured every obstacle the HOA threw their way, and with each passing day, the feeling of tension grew heavier. But despite the pressure, there was a sense of quiet determination that refused to be shaken. Every day that the landowner fought back, they were one step closer to reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about land. It was about standing up to the power and influence that so often trampled over those without a voice. The courtroom battles had taken their toll, but the landowner had never wavered. They had been through countless meetings with their lawyer, each time reviewing evidence, refining arguments, and preparing for whatever the HOA might throw at them next. The legal process was draining, and there were moments when it felt like they might not have the strength to continue. But then they would think about their family, about how this land had been passed down through generations. They couldn't give up now. They owed it to their ancestors and to themselves to see this through. The HOA, for their part, had grown increasingly aggressive. They weren't just trying to win the case. They were trying to break the landowner. Every legal maneuver they made was designed to wear the landowner down, to make them question whether it was worth continuing the fight. The HOA had the money, the connections, and the resources to keep the case going for years if they needed to. But what they didn't have was the landowner's will to fight. Then one morning, the landowner received a call that would change everything. It was from their lawyer, and the tone in their voice was different this time, more hopeful than the landowner had heard in months. "We've got something," the lawyer said, their voice steady but with an underlying excitement. "I think we've got them." The landowner's heart skipped a beat. They had been waiting for something, anything that would give them an advantage in the case. "What do you mean?" the landowner asked, unable to hide the hope that was starting to rise. "The HOA made a mistake," the lawyer explained. "They've been using a document as part of their defense, claiming that the land was sold to them legally. But I've just found evidence that proves the document was forged. The signatures are fake." It felt like a weight had been lifted from the landowner's shoulders. For so long they had been battling against a powerful organization, unsure of whether they would ever see justice. But now, with this new piece of evidence, the tables had turned. The lawyer had already started preparing the documents to present in court, and they believed that this revelation could be the key to winning the case. For the first time in a long time, the landowner felt a spark of hope. They had always believed that they were in the right, but now they had the proof to back it up. The thought of finally taking the HOA down, of reclaiming their land and seeing justice served, filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. The next court hearing was scheduled for the following week, and the landowner spent the days leading up to it preparing for the final showdown. The lawyer was confident, but the landowner knew that the HOA wouldn't go down easily. They would fight tooth and nail to keep their hold on the land. But now, with the forged document in hand, the landowner knew they had the upper hand. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge took his seat. The HOA's legal team was present, as polished and confident as ever. But the landowner could sense a shift. They knew that today the outcome would be different. Today they were going to win. The lawyer presented the new evidence, explaining how the document the HOA had used to justify their claim to the land had been forged. The signatures were examined by an expert, who confirmed that they were fake. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable as the landowner's lawyer laid out the facts. It was clear that the HOA had been hiding something, and now it was exposed. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The HOA's legal team tried to counter the evidence, but their arguments began to crumble in the face of the undeniable proof. The landowner's lawyer remained calm and collected, methodically dismantling the HOA's defense with each new piece of evidence. The landowner sat quietly, their hands clenched in their lap, watching as the case they had worked so hard for finally started to come together. The judge took a long time to deliberate. The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited for his decision. The landowner's heart raced. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the moment that would determine whether everything they had worked for would be worth it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence carefully," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And I've come to a decision. The HOA's claim to this land is invalid. The document they used to justify their actions was forged, and they have no legal right to the property." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the landowner couldn't believe what they were hearing. The judge's ruling was final. The landowner had won. They had won not just the land, but the fight for their family's legacy. The landowner's lawyer turned to them with a smile, and the relief that flooded through them was overwhelming. They had done it. After months of struggle, they had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. The land was theirs once again. The judge's ruling was a victory, but it didn't end there. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for the time and resources they had wasted in their attempt to steal the land. The homes that had been built on the land would be torn down, and the HOA was required to pay for the cost of removing them. It was a bittersweet victory. The landowner knew that the homes were already sold, and there were families living in them. It wasn't going to be easy, but the landowner knew that the HOA's actions had been wrong, and they couldn't allow it to go unpunished. They would work with the authorities to ensure that the families were relocated, and that the land was returned to its rightful owner. The battle was over, but the landowner knew that it wasn't the end of their journey. They had learned so much about the power of perseverance, about standing up for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. They had faced one of the most powerful organizations in the region and had come out on top, and now, with the land returned to them, they could finally begin to rebuild. As the landowner walked away from the courthouse, the weight that had been pressing on them for so long lifted. The sun was shining and the world seemed a little brighter. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where they would protect the land, preserve their family's legacy, and ensure that something like this would never happen again. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. They had won, and they knew that no matter what came next, they would always stand firm, ready to defend what was theirs.